For those of you who I haven't met already, my name's Denisha Quinlan. I'm CEO of the Fremantle Chamber of Commerce. This is obviously our beautiful building that we're very grateful to be hosting you in, and huge thanks to Claire and the WA Brewers Association for the opportunity to gather a whole industry of like-minded people. Often when we're dealing with export, we're talking to seafood people or liquor people or agriculture or wool, and it's just such a unique experience to talk to people who have a really strong passion in one particular area. We thought, given the role both at the Chamber and in our exporting area, but also across the whole gamut of how we get beer to new and interesting markets is quite wide and quite varied, that it would be wonderful to have, I guess, hear from a few different voices. And I'm really, really pleased to introduce our exceptional panel here today. Between the three of them, I think they must have about 60 to 70 years of getting things to market and making sure everything goes smoothly. And one of the really interesting things I've observed in my time here at the Chamber is exporting requires not only an incredible amount of industry knowledge in your own industry and your own products, but it also requires an awful lot of logistical information. It requires a hell of a lot of patience while you're dealing with international customs officers and customs and all sorts of different rafts of stakeholders and individuals. And it also requires an ability to really understand where you are in the supply chain. And I think today we're fortunate enough to hear from some people who have got a really good grasp of some core areas of the supply chain. Nathan Maxwell, who will be our first speaker, we are lucky enough to have on our Fremantle Chamber of Commerce board, and he's added so much value to our organisation over the last 2 years. Nathan has a really wide and varied background that he'll talk through in a minute, but at the moment is the marketing manager for JSL Seafood. And for most of you, I'm sure you're aware that COVID has hit the seafood industry in a particularly challenging and interesting way. And Nathan has been at the front line of all of that, and particularly in dealing directly with China, and also his role as on the Seafood Trade Advisory Group has been really instrumental at looking at what are some of the barriers to trade, how do we get flights into markets that don't go there, how do we make sure that the Chinese government, when your products get to export, don't suddenly turn around and throw it all back again, how do you make sure you've got the right certification to enable you to get the tariff reductions and things that you get. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Nathan today. To Nathan's left we have Brian, who is from ESS Shipping. And again, what we've seen in the last 12 months is one of our biggest hurdles sometimes is just physically getting product onto ships or onto planes and actually being able to get it to market. So really looking forward to hearing from you, Brian, about some of those challenges. And finally, our third speaker on the panel who will be talking alongside me is Marion from our export desk. Marion has had a really long history in export, from agriculture, wool, right through to a whole variety of industries, but has sat firmly and stoically at our export desk for nearly the last 4 years, isn't it, Marion? 5 years, yeah, that's right, we had a little celebration last week. So for 5 years, Marion has helped all sorts of exporters deal with really complex problems, but also really simple problems like how do I make sure my signature's big enough to be seen, through to how do I ensure that this document's going to get to the right place and I'm using the right form. So you should hopefully, by the end of today, have a really good understanding from a market perspective, from a logistics and shipping perspective, right down to some of the smaller details you need to make sure that your documents are in order, and as we said, that you get what you need. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Nathan, who's going to take you through what I like to call Export 101.
Thanks everyone for the opportunity to present today. As a big beer fan and cider, certainly happy to assist. I think I might just start with a fun fact. 50% of the world's beer is actually consumed in Asia, which is right on our doorstep. China alone in 2016 consumed 45 billion litres of beer, compared with Australia in the same year at 1.8 billion. So you kind of hear all these numbers when you're dealing with Asia and China, and you find them quite overwhelming. Just to put that into perspective, that's 138 billion middies consumed in 2016 in China alone, so quite amazing. So I guess the question is, should you be factoring exports into your business plans? And I really hope after today's session that you've got some more clarity around that and maybe some steps to start to head down that pathway. And I know some of you today are sort of on that journey already. So as introduced, Director of JSJ Seafood in Tasmania and a Marketing Manager of Three Capes Marketing, which is based here in Perth, and chairman of the Seafood Trade Advisory Group. Quick introduction about what we do, just to kind of set the background. So JSJ Seafood in Tasmania, we handle around 30% of the live lobster sector. We've got 2 export facilities, one on King Island, one on the east coast of Tribunna. So our 15 staff are busy collecting lobster, crayfish from our fishing fleet pretty much every day of the year. That's then transported to charter flights to meet commercial airlines, which goes all across Asia, and it's a every day a year business. Three Capes Marketing, this is our offshoot company that we've formed here in WA. We manage 8 species globally, from Zambia through to supply countries of Canada, Brazil, and of course out of Australia as well. We ship 600 tonne per annum, it's around 50 million in sales. We've got 21 buyers globally that we ship to, predominantly though in Asia, which is 6 markets, and again, I don't get any days off. My industry role, so we formed the Seafood Trade Advisory Group, and that was really to provide advice to government, so mainly federal government, around what our industry needs and wants. And in particular when we have market trade and access issues. So right now we're having, if you just read the paper, a lot of issues with China pretty much every day. Today there was a new one with coal, and it could be us next. So we're providing a lot of advice around that space. Our industry collectively represents $1 billion in GDP activity, and that includes all up and down regional coastal areas. We've done a lot of work on free trade agreements. Chapter, that's the China Free Trade Agreement, was the big one. And government policies, the latest one is $700 million investment in freight to allow us to meet our export markets during COVID. So enough about me. From an export point of view, where to begin, I guess, is the question a lot of us are asking. So I've just run through some of the basic areas that you should be considering when looking to develop an export market. Most of this I find actually can be done via desktop research, so you don't need to go out doing surveys, and a lot of this work can be done initially online. There's a wealth of data there, a lot that can be found to understand your consumer initially, look at some of the trends, gaps in market, and I think really good is to start looking at your competitors as well in that space. Starting at the start, obviously your product, it's really important that you understand your own product, its place, where it sits in the market currently. Work through some of the questions around what are your points of difference, of course, what's your product story, and you guys will be familiar with this just in your own Australian context. It's important to start to look at what segment you think your product would start to fit into. Do you have the right size format for the market? A heavy stout beer sold in a long neck format to Hong Kong might not be right. So questions like that you need to start working through. Of course, start to build some understanding of what are prices in the markets that you're looking at. I find it useful to look at other brands at this point in time, so companies that you might aspire to globally that you're following, and start to look at what was their journey, what markets are they in, and even start to look at what have they done to their product that might differ from how they sell it at home. So a US beer sold into Shanghai, have they adjusted the flavouring or the packaging to suit? Customers, unfortunately we all need customers, so who are they? Where are they? Which markets? Again, just some of the questions you want to start going through. What are they looking for? What do they need? Importantly, what can they pay? What are they paying now? And how are they accessing it? I know in China, in my own experience, that they're looking for more the lighter tasting pale ales and pilsners, lighter strength at this stage. So you guys being in the brewing industry, what would be the logical next step for beer drinkers on that journey as they transition? It's also important at this point to not only consider your end customer or consumer, obviously very important, but the people along the way that you'll have to engage with are also your customers, so people in the supply chain, whether they're agents, or just various distributors in the supply chain. It's also really important to understand how supply chains vary by market. For example, Japan often has many traditional layers that you need to work through, and trying to jump to the end point, often you'll find you'll get pushed back. Whereas Singapore, in my experience, you can work closer with supermarkets with some local assistance, so that'll vary by market as well. From another desktop research point of view, I'm a really big fan of just doing the macro data research first. So start with trade numbers, particularly from Australia in your segment. A lot of this data is available through industry associations, Bureau of Statistics, trade publications. And what you want to do is look for our export numbers in your category. I'd also look at, say, New Zealand as well, so a comparable country in our region. And then reverse that data and look at maybe some of the markets you're interested in. So if you said China, look at the China market and find out who they're importing from, and then start to drill down into that data. And when you get the data, you can start to ask some questions around, there's an inconsistency there, or why is that happening? And I'll just run you through an exercise of how that could work. So I spent 30 minutes researching for this presentation on a couple of trade portals. Now, please don't use these as gospel, because it was pretty quick, needs to be interrogated further. But what I found in that time, I'll take you on the journey how that works. So firstly, you'll see HS code, which is 220300, beer from malt. Now, HS system codes are what's used globally in trade to identify and classify different products. Importing countries such as China will use that to then determine what's the rate of tariff or taxes that will be applied, and that will vary again by market. For example, beer made from malt, as I said, is that number. Another number would be 220291, which is for a non-alcoholic beer. There'll be a different one again for cider. So this data set actually looks at the greatest opportunity for Australian beer to be exported. So what are the best markets according to this portal? This factors in proximity to market, trade agreements that are in place, demand coming out of those markets already, and a whole range of other metrics. In this case, it's showing China, USA, and Singapore. So then if we take China as our market that we're going to look at, we put in the same product code again, it now starts to show us what are the current export trade data. In this case, Germany, Mexico, Netherlands are shipping the highest quantity. And interestingly, this data set also shows that they've got the greatest potential to increase. I'm not sure how they pull that figure, but it may be because of the exports to surrounding countries in Asia. If China starts paying a higher price, they can divert volumes. They've got additional capacity to ship. German beer, if you've travelled to China, is pretty well known. Parts of China were actually German colonies, so a lot of the brewing that's happened over there has come from near that kind of style up in Qingdao. So I've taken the same trade data set and put it into a trade map, and again I can see this is exporting countries who ship to China, so I can see who the leading countries are. I can actually see the volume and the value as well. It's measured by value per tonne. It's interesting here, if you look at Germany, for example, they've got the highest quantity exported into China. However, their value is quite a lot lower. So you can start to pull some information out of these around, okay, Germany's got a really high market share, but they've pursued a lower part of the market in the segment. And if you look at their imported growth rates and values, they're actually declining at the moment. And so my interpretation of that is they're competing now at the bottom end with Chinese brewers who are just getting better and better and better. And that bottom end of the market, whilst big, is that somewhere that Australia would want to play in? Not necessarily, I wouldn't have thought. If we look at Mexico, jumped right up to answer the question why, that would be something worth looking at. Interestingly, New Zealand round out the top 20 here, and we can see that they're sort of in the top 4 at the moment in price, so they're pursuing a higher end of the segment, albeit on small numbers. So then to drill down on what's happening in New Zealand, and hopefully you can stay with me here. So if we look at beverages exported from New Zealand, so imported into China, we can see that water is actually doing quite well. Who would have thought exporting water would be a thing, but it's a thing. Their grape business is growing as well, and of course the beer data that we saw before is showing up. We do the same data set, but looking at China's imports from Australia. We can see that our wine figures are enormous into China, yet our beer figures are really low. So low that I'd actually like to go and check that further, but they really appear quite small compared to others. We can see here that zero tariff applied. So then when I look again across commodity, but within the same category, we look at wine exports, imports of wine into China by country. Australia are leading with France, and in fact Australia's managed to be highest volume and also one of the highest values as well. And so Wine Australia have done a great job in that market. They've invested a lot, they've done a lot of work with Austrade and other associations. What's interesting here is we can see New Zealand make the list in wine. So from the quick data that we've looked at, New Zealand beer performs better than Australia and China, yet Australian wine just absolutely dominates with France. So my interpretation of this data, and based on what I know with how the wine industry is working in China, it suggests that there's actually a really great platform for Australian brewers to hit that market. A lot of the work's been done. Consumers in China are very familiar with Australian wine. They're very similar consumers that you'd be talking to as well. It's not just the consumers who are aware of Australia, obviously, when it comes to beverages, but it's the trade. So the people that you want to distribute your product are familiar with working with Australian companies. They know our brands, they know our systems. So looking at that, there's actually a really large platform and base to work from, and looks like New Zealand are starting to do that. So at this stage, you've considered product attributes, you've looked at customer profiles, perhaps identified a number of markets and maybe some gaps using that sort of high-level data. The next step really is to work through the costs that are in exporting and the charges, so you can bring it down to a cost per unit. When selecting markets, it's really important to, and all through your product and customer phase, start to look at trends and just test some of your assumptions around what's happening. But not just how they're consuming, but how they're accessing as well. So if we said, from what I can read, there's a movement towards craft beer in China, but they're doing it online. So you've got two trends that are moving. So to start to investigate that space and how you might work within it. Another trend that I have seen I've probably been to China 50 times in the last 10 years, is the movement to sophisticated consumers. It's been talked about a lot, but I've seen Chinese consumers really transition an enormous amount and move from just buying brands for brand's sake to now wanting to understand it for their own knowledge, to demonstrate their own sophistication to their friends. And it's a very real thing that's transitioning at the moment. It's happened with wine, and I've no doubt it's happening with beer and cider as well. So after all this sort of data work that you're looking at, it's definitely time to start putting that into an export plan, just start to build out export plan for each market. Do you have the marketing collateral? Do you have to adapt it? Do you have to adapt your product? Start to map out what some of the costs are. And is your website even ready for international business? So start to test some of those theories through the export plan process. And there's plenty of those online to work through as well. So what next? You've selected a market or markets to look at. You've got a basic understanding of costs and what might be involved with taxes. Your export plan's a working document underway, but you really need to start reaching out and making relationships at this point. My experience finding buyers, what underpins all of this really is relationships, with the exception of online platforms, which is transforming that to a degree. But I'll just talk through each of these. Obviously we can't travel at the moment, so this is something that's difficult, but when the world changes again, the ability to go and see markets in action, see your consumers, see what your competitors are doing, it's something you can't do from here. It's incredibly important. I found that a lot of the trade shows, particularly if you pick the right one, I've just chosen 3 here randomly, it's a really good mix of new entrants, so aspiring exporters, and then your really entrenched brands as well, who are sort of fighting for market share. But it's quite a good dynamic to be involved in, a lot of energy. Of course, clients and people you can meet. Be sure to pack a tyre with you, because you'll get lots of people kicking it when you're there, unfortunately. But I must say, having been to all these shows, I've learned probably just as much from competitors that I deal with, about what they're doing, and built some really good friendships and a lot of assistance in dealing with markets through that as well. It's kind of how I thought my life would be, travelling. Unfortunately, it was much more like this, and these bags don't come for free, I'm afraid. But I wouldn't change it. It is what it is, and it's all of the learnings I have now are basically from doing that time. I would really recommend to reach out to Austrade and the other state government teams that are existing. They've got in-market teams. At the moment, Austrade have been charged with working with exporters a lot more in Australia, because their ability to obviously do trade shows and things are limited at the moment to none. So they've really been tasked with helping new exporters and new companies. So I'd make the most of reaching out to them. It is a bureaucracy, so it can be tough at times to work through, but just be a squeaky wheel, keep pushing, They have done a lot of work with Wine Australia, and I'd keep saying I think that's a great one to hook onto. A lot of the wine networking events they've done, no doubt there's a spin-off of beer and cider as well within that. They also can provide funding for grants, and particularly if you're going to do it as a more of collaborative approach, say Western Australia Brewers, that can help. So make sure you look for those that can support travel and trade shows. They are doing some digital trade shows at the moment. I haven't actually experienced one. I can't say it would be as good as the real thing, but certainly time to start. Online platforms, everyone's heard about these and talked about them. In my industry, it hasn't really taken off. The nature of our product is quite specialised. But I have seen how it works in action in China, and even the way that supermarkets have evolved there. You don't take cash. You barely carry your bags home. Everything gets delivered to your door straight away. It's more of an experience. They've got robot trolleys that follow you behind now. The Asian market space has changed so quickly. But within that, consumers are changing how they access and find brands. They typically, there's no minimum order. You can order something online and it's delivered to your door within 15 minutes, 20 minutes if it's a Huma. That's what they pride themselves on, so quite remarkable. JD actually have an office and a distribution hub in Melbourne, so something that you can sort of reach out to and learn a bit more from this point of view. This is one I'd recommend. Australian agents or any agents who are Australian based in the market that you can build a relationship with. Tapping into their existing knowledge and relationships is just a really efficient way to jump a lot of the work that you're going to have to do, particularly if you can't travel. This is not a plug for my business at all, but our offshoot, Three Capes Marketing, this is essentially what we do. So we take smaller seafood companies that don't have scale in terms of clients overseas. One recently came to us. They had a great supply line coming into their business, but they just couldn't access overseas markets. They'd been to a number of trade shows, picked up one client, but their business was still limited even though they had a really good platform underneath. Within 12 months, we transformed them to be a fully export-led business, opened up clients across all of Asia. So we do that in a transparent manner. Unfortunately, we don't do it in this category, but if you can find someone who does this sort of work, build a relationship, it can really help you ramp things up quite quickly. Just to run through, and I'll speed things up here, just to be, I guess you're getting closer to exporting at this point in time. Hopefully you've been to a few trade shows or you've got some inquiries through Austrade to follow up. I'll just run through a basic export process. Some of this will touch on maybe the other presentations, but again, you'll need to, through the whole export plan, just be getting right across what are the import standards. A lot of the standards are based on, which you'd probably be familiar already with ISO codes, but each market can have differences. Labelling is really important, as in if you're bringing product here, it would be the same sort of requirements, quite strictly enforced. Again, being right across your export costs at this point in time, not only tariffs, taxes, duties, but what's your agent's fee? If you have to incur freight costs, what are those costs? And what are the yields based on your freight as well and how that's impacted? Really basic overview before I finish, just to run through an export process. So you've done a deal with an importer, you've signed an agreement. You will need to register your company and labels with, in this case, China AQSIQ, which is their customs website, along with your HS product code. In terms of selling, you would work on Incoterms, which you might touch on again yourself, but basically that's the transferal of product risk. So if you're going to ship the product, you might agree free on board Perth, at which point your obligation and your risk on product ends when you transfer the product to the ship. And your client would then be charged with insuring the goods if they choose to market, and also clearing the goods. It's important to note though that that doesn't cover product liability in terms of if someone got sick. It's purely on the risk of transit. If you are having to do freight, if it's a CIF scenario, shipping agents can help you handle carriage, do the loading, assist with documentation as well. Goods get to market, customs are cleared, goods inspected, cargo cleared. That process is happening all the time, so it's not as daunting as it sounds. Payment, obviously, that's actually the most important part of any trade. So depending on the terms in your industry, it'll vary. Might be prepayment, it might be based on letter of credit, other terms. Just to summarise, look, yes, exporting is challenging, incredibly rewarding, but it's really important to note that these markets are actually existing now, they're functioning, people are doing what you're hoping to do all the time. It does take time, it does take a commitment from your business to do that, and an understanding that if you go down that path, be prepared to ramp up capacity to fill orders as well. So just be aware. Be right across your research and understanding your product, your export costs, build those relationships in market, and network. And I think collaborate is actually the key as well. I think that's a really big part. So I've got some resources which I can share, and hopefully not as confused as this guy by the end of that.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I thought we'd just do a bit of a panel session at the end, just with all your questions. So feel free to hold them for a second. Brian's going to take us through some shipping now. Nathan, thank you so much. The amount of research you did in an industry that I know isn't one of the hats of the many hats you wear was extraordinary. So thank you, and I'm sure everyone in the room really valued the time that you put into that. So thank you very much.
G'day everyone, I'm Brian Hack from EES Shipping. We're an ex-Fremantle company, but we've moved out down past Coburn Central recently.
We still classify that as part of
Yeah, Coburn, Fremantle. We grew up here.
The greater Fremantle area.
Yeah, I used to work at 11 Cliff Street, just over here. So, like the old part of Fremantle. I love this area. I also love beer, as you can tell. I kind of look like the last thing a craft beer sees as it goes to its final resting place. Obviously I just want to talk to you about shipping, some of your target markets, obviously some common terms that we use, and some of the current shipping constraints that seem to be going on at the moment. First things first, it's craft beer. You want it kept cool, right? So got to be kept at 4 degrees, I guess, standard fridge temperature. You want to be using refrigerated containers. These things transport sensitive cargo all around the world. Obviously, when air freight's not working, you guys could use these sort of things. They have integrated power units, so they can be run by hardline power at your premises or gensets, and they can range from negative 65 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees with various temperatures. So it's going to keep your beer fresh all the way to your target market. The dimensions of a reefer are a bit smaller than your standard container, so you're going to lose a bit of space like when it comes to your the refrigeration unit. Also the insulation and the T airflow flooring. In a 20-foot reefer, you should be able to fit about 20 double-stacked pallets. Probably smaller skids, not your Shep-sized pallets. So you want to keep airflow moving throughout the container. In a 40-foot reefer, you'd fit about 40 double-stacked skids. So don't forget we need to use ISPM or export pallets or plastic pallets, those sort of things, so that they don't get stopped by quarantine in other countries. Now this is the thing that might actually be a good thing for the West Australian brewers, is buyers consolidations. So if you're testing a market, sending a small pallet, which you said earlier, is not very easy because you want to send it in a refrigerated container. These don't actually go out that often. So if as a collaborative group, you can get together, let's say 20 pallets, then you could ship your own consolidated pallet to a buyer, which let's say you'd helped organise and that sort of thing. Obviously this keeps the costs down. Otherwise you want to be sending just your own refrigerated container with, let's say, 4 or 5 pallets, but then that's blowing out the costs, especially landed as well. Common shipping terms. Obviously, I don't really need to speak too much about Incoterms because Marion's going to talk about those. Nope.
No. I was going to just follow up on you.
Yeah, we've got the book.
Yeah, I've got the book.
As Nathan said, like Incoterms are the essential terms for the trade, like sale of trade. They talk about who covers what, who's paying what, who handles the risk, and who pays for the freight, insurance, all of that sort of stuff. Then you've got to consider transit times on the water. Let's say to Singapore, Singapore or Malaysia, it's 6 to 7 days. Hong Kong, Vietnam, India, you'll get there in 18 to 25, and the UAE in about 20 to 30 days. Plus you've got to account for time to pack the container and unpack the container at each end. Things you need to consider as well, is your trucking here? Do you want it refrigerated? If you're consolidating it, more than likely. And just your packaging, documents, which Marion will talk about, like bills of lading, house bills. The consignee is the receiver, the consignor is the shipper. These are terms that you'll start to become familiar with as you start doing shipping. They'll be on your bills of lading. That's who you'll talk to your clients about. Your destination agents and customs brokers over there, they'll be the ones helping clear the goods and arrange it for your clients. And very important at the moment is the chain of responsibility and SOLAS regulations. So like actual weights of goods need to be, to the kilo if preferable. This allows the ship masters to balance loads and that sort of stuff. Always, insurance. It'll never happen to me. Yes, it'll never happen to me. But you don't want a whole shipment of beer to go, let's say the genset fails or something like that. Insurance will get it fixed, sorted straight away. You get your money back and you can start the process again. Obviously, CIVs, commercial invoices and packing lists, you'll need to create these documents because they'll be required at both ends. And then obviously we've spoken about certs of origin and HS codes already. Okay, I'm just sort of going to flick through these a little bit quickly since you don't need to see a whole lot of data. But I got asked to talk about a few target markets, so Singapore's one of them. The revenue in the beer segment is about 1.83 billion Aussie in 2020, and they expect it to grow annually by about 12.6%. Works out to be about $315 per person in revenue, which seems like rookie numbers if you're an Australian. And the average consumption is about 18 litres. Now, I saw some research recently where they did some surveys with some of the younger population, and they reckon around about 41% of the people surveyed were more than happy to pay an extra 25% for a craft beer in these markets, like in Singapore, Malaysia and Vietnam. So the market's there, they are looking at it. I went to Malaysia recently, and the craft beer is actually a segment that's growing. It's in the pubs, it's in the taverns and that sort of stuff. It's in the cities, and the populations there are just absolutely massive. With Singapore, the importer will need an import license from the Singapore Food Agency. Obviously, they have their duties and GSTs, and you've got to beat this guy. If you've tasted Tiger before, then obviously you know why. It's light, it's easy to drink in a hot, humid market. That's probably something you should be aiming for, which is what you said, aim for your market. You probably don't want, I'll leave this in there and you guys can have this. It's just all the nitty-gritty stuff of importing, all the legal stuff. Hong Kong, they're worth 1.38 billion and they're expected to grow by another 11%. 18 litres per person. I think Australia, they're about 56 litres per person. But these markets are growing. Obviously, you want to watch out for Hong Kong at the moment with the China agreement that seems to be going on there, but it's still a valid market, right? And Hong Kong's a free port, so there's no taxes to be paid. It's only wine that's subject to certain import permits and licenses. So obviously the chance to keep your prices lower in Hong Kong is a really good idea. Vietnam. Beer segment's worth $9 billion. Compared to Australia, I think we're about $15 billion. So that's quite up there, but it's expected to grow by 15% per year. And they're drinking about 38.4 litres per person. Yes. And beers that with these guys, obviously you need an import license with Vietnam, and it's strictly controlled by authorities, so you need to watch out for product labels. It needs to conform with all Vietnamese regulations.
We probably get most of our queries or comebacks on certs from Vietnam. At the moment, it's one that does come through a lot.
Yeah, well, like Australia, like our food department, the labelling has to be specific, has to name what the ingredients are, and in a specific way. Obviously, you can have a look at that a bit later. It's all like their import taxes and whatnot. India. This is one that's probably worth getting into. What's that worth? That should be a decimal point, I think. Yeah, $119.6 billion in India, and expected to grow by 11%. The numbers are a bit lower, but the population is obviously massive, so drinking 3.4 litres per year. I know they drink a lot of whiskey there as well, so craft beer is definitely something to get into. And yeah, alcoholic beverages operate under an open general license. So there's no specific license, you just have to have the import-export code issued to your client. The UAE. I got asked about the UAE, which I thought was an interesting one. It's obviously a smaller market, 200 million, but it's expected to grow every year. Be interesting to see who wants to send there, and yeah. But they're still consuming about 3 litres per year. So for non-alcoholic beer, there's minimal controls, but for alcoholic beer, then you need to have a valid trade license. And I think the customs duty is about 50%, so it's quite high. But with a city like that, they can probably afford it, right? Obviously, the documentation that comes with it would be, like, they require original documents, so you'd have to have stamped signed copies of everything, health certificates and certs of origin, so you'd need that to clear that in there. And then obviously there's all their food labelling requirements, which are quite hefty as well. Malaysia is one that I chucked in there because I went there recently and it was actually quite thriving. It's worth $1.4 billion and it's just growing every year. Spend about $43 per person, but there's quite a substantial population there. Now the interesting one there is importing beer into Malaysia, or any alcoholic beverage, requires a license from the Director General, and each bottle would have a little stamped label that fits over the lid, and they have it for beer, wine, spirits, and everything like that. Yeah, so currently, at the moment, there's a few constraints going on. Space on vessels. A lot of vessels are booked out, the export market's booked out, and if you're using refrigerated containers, then you're also fighting for space and equipment with the food market, because Australia's a massive exporter of food and drinks. And the seasonal pricing, obviously it changes as the year goes through. Summer, we have more fruit and veg, so obviously the price of shipping goes up, and then during winter it sort of calms down a little. And air freight, just as a thought, the costs are substantially higher. And I think Nathan was saying you're paying 4 times the price. So he's paying 4 times the price for exporting crayfish. Transit's obviously faster, and it's currently not really an option during COVID, but it could be something you consider if you want to send samples, definitely. Okay, cool.
Righty.
Questions, we'll wait till later?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you very much.
As you can probably feel in this beautiful boardroom. The Fremantle Chamber of Commerce has been here since 1873. We're the oldest chamber in Western Australia and the second oldest in Australia. And we were actually formed to deliver to the needs of shippers, merchants and traders originally. So that, in case you're wondering why you're coming here to talk export, we are uniquely one of the only non-state-based chambers that has the authority to work in the export arena and to authorise certificates of origin and free trade agreements as a result of our delegation from the Australian Chamber. So we're in a very unique position to be right by a port, to have a wide variety of industries, both within Fremantle, but we also certify documents for South Australia, Victoria, when they all go home over there. We're often still alive and working, so we do have a great opportunity to work with the diversity of industries. We, I guess, have both that component, which Marion's going to talk through, but like Nathan was highlighting earlier through his incredible work as chairman of STAG and through some of the stakeholder relationships we have, we've been very actively involved in some of the advocacy. As Brian mentioned, during COVID, when our exporters couldn't get flights, we worked really quickly and quite strongly with DFAT and other stakeholders to make sure that we could get some kind of flight assistance program up, and together with the support of a number of our stakeholders, I think had some quite successful outcomes there despite the challenges. So when you're working with the Chamber here, I guess it's important to know that we're a port of call for business, so we're here to try and point you in the right direction, to really be a conduit to assist you with contacts at DFAT or contacts with other stakeholders, but also on a nuts and bolt basis to help you with your certification and your documentation. So we process over 10,000 certs every year, and we represent now close to, I think it's even increased considerably in the last year. That's quite an old number. So we're up to about over 300 exporters and well and truly over 50 agents. Our track record for accuracy is quite well renowned throughout nationally in particular, and that's really thanks to Marion's thorough eye. If you are exporting through us, she will occasionally give you some quite strong words about making sure that you've dotted and crossed every T and every I, but it does ensure that we have a really low pushback from customs officers overseas for verification and other things because of that accuracy and attention to detail. As we discussed earlier, around 85% of our certs are processed electronically, but for some markets, particularly the Middle East and meat and a few of those products, they still do require manual certification. So throughout COVID, we had to keep our export desk open, and our staff, Chelsea, Giselle and Marion, did an amazing job managing some of the challenges there. So you know we are always here, and we are classified as an essential service to make sure that you can get your goods to market. So I'm going to hand over to Marion, who's going to run you through a bit of an FAQ around some of the processes. If you haven't got one already, you can always pick up a pack on the way out because there's some great examples of some of the documentation you might need to look at. But I'm going to hand over to you, Marion, to talk through those things.
Hi, everyone. Everyone, normally the first question they ask is, what is a certificate of origin and why do we need to have it? So for your product, one of the main things that you need to have a certificate of origin is to keep the provenance of your product that you're creating. So when it gets to your importer, it has provenance to follow it all the way through. One of these key documents is a certificate of origin, whether it's a free trade agreement or whether it's a certificate of Australian origin. Obviously, the free trade agreements involve the tariff reductions, but a certificate of Australian origin also helps assist clearance with customs because you have the correct documentation. No one wants their product to be held up in port and encouraging demurrage. That is one word that anybody hates ever hearing. So what is a certificate of origin? It's a document that certifies the place of the growth, production or manufacture of the goods. It's required when exporting to specific countries when requested by the consignee, and as Ryan said earlier, the consignee is the person who's receiving the goods, who's purchasing the goods. For the purpose of customs clearance, or when it's a stipulation of a letter of credit. So anyone that's ever dealt with a letter of credit, you know that you have to follow every single step and it has to be accurate and dot and cross your T's. The certificate of origin identifies the goods and contains an express certification by a government authority. So as Denisha said, that we are one of the authorised bodies. We're an agent of the Australian Chamber of Commerce, and we're authorised by DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trades, to actually certify these documents for exporters. There is a list there of the free trade agreements. I think in a lot of the cases, the Australia-New Zealand one would cover a lot of the exports to Malaysia, Singapore, they're all part of that. So Vietnam, the countries, they are all part of that free trade agreement. Japan has their own, so you can use JPA for that. Thailand has its own. And then the chapter, which is the biggest free trade agreement for nearly all products in Australia at the moment, is another one as well. When you're dealing with a certificate of origin, so when we say certificate of origin, as I said, it's a certificate of origin as a free trade agreement or a certificate of Australian origin. So you have two different fields that are going down. We talk about them as preferential and non-preferential, but the basis of them is of the free trade agreements in comparison to the certificate of Australian origin is the benefits of the free trade agreement is it gives you better access to important markets, it gives you improved competitive position for Australian exporters, more prospects for increased two-way investment and reduced regulatory barriers in different service sectors. Now this all sounds very long-winded, but all this information is on DFAT's website with any of these free trade agreements which you want to look at. Now, how do you find and get access to all this information? Well, as Brian said, your HS code, and Nathan brought up as well, the HS code for your beer is that 2203000, and as soon as you click that in, it will actually start to lead you into different areas where you can find a lot of this information. I've included a lot of, this can be emailed too, so there's a lot of links here for the Free Trade Agreement portal. Where this is very important with DFAT too is it can lead you into finding out what your tariffs are, what your regulations are. Also, there's information on a lot of these websites. Nathan touched on it about Austrade. So as exporters, you might be interested in finding out how can you get an export grant or financial assistance because you're either startup or you're actually wanting to branch into export. So there is, I've only listed a couple here. There's the EMDG, that's through Austrade. There's also Export Finance Australia, and they all have assistance to help you get your product to market. Austrade are they are hard to get onto the right person to start with, but once you start making the inquiries, they are very, very good at assisting people, and at the moment, with the restrictions that we've got, they have more staff on the ground here in Australia now helping people, so this is a prime time to use them as much as you possibly can. There's also some links here for some helps. So the Austrade have a help one, DFAT have a help link. There also, I know it's a bit short notice, but there is DFAT run via Austrade some free trade agreement digital seminars. There's one on tomorrow afternoon.
So if you haven't got enough export tonight, you can tune in tomorrow night and that even more.
But if you register with Austrade for these free trade agreements, all of the previous ones for the ANZVTA, which is the Australia-New Zealand one, which includes Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, they are all available to go back and look at them. And a lot of them give you then advice and help how to move on to the next stage. So that's basically it on the difference of your certificates of origin.
Thanks, Mary. Do you want to talk through a couple?
Just add to that quickly, there's actually a new Austrade portal under final stage of testing now. So about a month from now, it should be released, which I'll send you on the link here if you can pass through. Basically, that harmonises all of what Marion said into a really easy-to-use portal, which can step you through.
Yeah.
The new one looks really, really good. So,
Okay. That was the one they put a questionnaire out on about a month from
Yeah,
tour
yeah,
guide?
so in that final stage now, but it looks really good. It looks user-friendly, whereas traditionally it's still been, you had to pull a lot of stuff together and lots of questions, but, and yeah, use the Austrade support at the moment too.
And Maren, do you want to just talk through that procedure for obtaining a certificate and a couple of the examples of the certificates the guys have got in their packs as well?
Right. So one of the first things at the export desk, the first question I get from a new exporter is, my client wants, or my consignee wants a certificate of origin, how do I go about doing it? Well, these are legal requirements. This is not just something the Chamber dreams up. So the very first thing that you have to do is actually register with a delegated authority. In this case, we're talking about the Fremantle Chamber of Commerce. So there's an information form, and they word it that way. It's not a registration form, it's an information form, because what it is, it's giving the Chamber all the information from you as the exporter, which is legally then recorded as an authorised body for us to accept submissions from you so that we can stamp a document. So there's a form. I won't give you the technical names for them because everyone's got a CO4, CO6, CO9, you know. But basically what it is, and the packs have the information form so you can see what we're talking about. After that, so once you've registered with us, then you go on the central registry that is only accessible to the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, not to any other chamber, so all your information is confidential. Then you complete the form, return it to us with a copy of your business registration or your ABN, and then you sign an authorised list of anyone in your company who's allowed to sign documents on your behalf. If you're going to use a freight forwarder, there's another form that gets filled out, and your agent will actually supply that, and then you will supply a letter of authority giving your agent permission to sign all the documents on your behalf. So when you're using a freight forwarder, the good thing about that is you give them the responsibility of making sure your documents are all compliant. They handle them for you. They submit everything to all the authorities, get them all stamped correctly, and then they hand them back to you, and then you go ahead with your clearance. When you, for the first time in particular, if you've got to provide evidence of origin, so we will sort of take your word for it in a way that if you say you're making beer and it's Australian product, we can check that very easily. If it was, for example, I had one recently and they were exporting, not a fresh produce, but it was a motor for a vehicle. It was a Cummins motor, and they said it was Australian origin. Well, part of my job is actually to know or check these things. Well, Cummins motors are only made in the USA, so they cannot be of Australian origin. So that's when would go back to them, or you as an exporter would provide information to prove where did your goods come from, where was their origin. Once that's all in compliance, then we can proceed with the stamping. It's just little technical things, but they have to be always signed in blue because of fraudulent copies. The rule came in a few years ago. They always have to be signed on the left-hand side. Certificates of origin, Australian origin, they can't be used for any other. So if your goods, if you created a beer that you knew that the malt came from Indonesia, but you imported the actual malt and then made the beer out of part of the proceeds, it's not wholly obtained, it's not all Australian. So you can't use an Australian origin, but you can use a declaration of origin that states part of it came from somewhere else. There is some complex rules that actually says that if you import part of the product, but then create the end product that changes the character of the product, then you can say, yes, it still is Australian origin. So there is some complex rules. So this is where it is very important to use the right people to actually get your product to market, to use the right documents to have them checked correctly with people, because freight forwarders and chambers, we know all these little rules, and that we're there to help you, not to penalise you for using something wrong. They always have to be typed. A lot of exporters, when they first start it, they say, oh, I forgot to put the date in. Can't I just write the date in? No, you can't. Everything has to be typed. If you think about a manual, a wet signature one that you were talking about with Asia, Qatar in particular, are very anti-electronic. China, for chapter, love them. So they handle them, they're high tech, they understand that. Qatar, no. So they're very insistent on having what we call wet signatures. So you have to make sure that it's signed correctly in the right place. And if it's manual, as I said, it has to be signed in blue. And you can't put any handwriting on them at all apart from your signature.
And
So-
you need to practice your signature, as we often learn. Because
terrifying.
sometimes if you have a bad day, they'll knock it back.
It's actually terrifying. So every 6 months, every chamber in Australia has to submit our signatures to DFAT. And they go to every customs port in the world. So every 6 months, we have to sign these forms and send them off. So when it comes to, in particular, you was mentioning Vietnam. So when a certificate of free trade agreement comes up in Vietnam and they look at it, they look at the one that was sent out 6 months ago and they'll look at it and go, that doesn't look the same. And they'll reject it on that. They are that strict. So most times we go back to them and they say, yes, because you're not looking at this 6 months, you're looking at last 6 months. So because people do change the signature, change them a bit. And manual is a big issue with that, but electronic is, and digitally is the way things are going. So we did a 4-day seminar with finance in Asia about products and provenance. And what they're saying is digitally is the way everything is going to go. So if you can prove from where your barley came from, so this is talking about the provenance, if you can prove where your growers grew it, and you can send it all the way through to the market, and you've got that provenance line all the way through, your product will sell itself because it has that trust factor in it. And you were talking about that Australia, the people that help, the Australian Asian, sorry, when you were saying you can contact them and they can help?
The Australian
agents.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just in
That's the type of thing that they're talking about because they're backing up your product. And you've got the provenance to show that what you actually made is going to get to that country and it's not going to get rebottled into something and sold as something else. So that's basically what the origin helps with along the way.
Thanks so much, Marion. So hopefully you're all still with us. You probably have heard there's a lot of really interesting trade, market, research components. There's a lot of getting into market, getting to know people, building relationships. But there's an awful lot of just really quite detailed crossing and dotting T's to make sure that this stuff actually gets to where it needs to go and how it works through. We will put this both live on our website. Claire will have a copy and we'll also obviously share the documentation. We also run a monthly Set the Month in Motion podcast forum, and we did run a really quite interesting one with some wine and octopus folk that had some really interesting tips around packaging and building relationships and doing really good preparation before you go into trade shows and those sorts of things. So that's called Getting Your Product to Market, and you're more than welcome. That's free on any podcast station under Set the Month in Motion. So feel free to download that and have a really good listen. Some of the product stuff was really interesting, and I think Marion's point also about provenance and how important it is to be able to demonstrate that goes back to what Nathan started with, of knowing your market. And what we do know, particularly in China and a number of those Asian countries, is why they want Australian products over all of those other imported products is because they see us as healthy and fresh and clean, and they're really important marketing attributes, and part of your provenance goes to showing that and then refrigerating it to make sure it gets there in good quality. It all completes the circle. On that, I'd love to hand over to you. Please feel free to direct a question to any one of our panel if you have any. Sir.
Do you think there's an advantage between trying to export bottled beer or canned beer because of the weight differential?
So bottled versus can,
right.
right?
I mean, bottles are quite a bit heavier than cans. Is there a case for just exporting cans rather than bottles?
The weight, obviously if you're sending air freight, you'd probably want to send cans. But if you're sending sea freight, it probably has about the same footprint as cans, or maybe a little bit bigger. But then
I don't like beer out of cans very much. So.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Most countries you go to, it's definitely in bottles, right? Yeah. So, but the weight shouldn't be a problem. Like, you know, these containers can take 20 plus tons. So I don't think it'd be sticking more than 20 tons worth of...
Thinking ahead about when we might start exporting some gin soon.
Yeah. Gin?
Yeah.
Do it in bottles. Yeah.
Brewed nearby. Distilled nearby.
Yeah.
Nathan, did you have any comment just on bottles versus cans and some of those, I guess, differences in terms of market penetration?
Again, it's market driven. So what's the market using? You know, and you do see both when you're there, but often you see, you know, in the deli section they sell the big cans, but that's a different price point that they're working on. And I imagine you guys are working in the more premium segment, so it'll probably be bottles. But again, it might be specific to cider, might be more cans. So. Again, market-driven, always.
Anyone else want to ask anything of the panel while they're here? Claire?
So is it just the certificate of origin that you need from the chamber? Essentially, that's the only documentation that needs to go with your product?
From us, there's a variety that we can help you with, isn't there? So it
From
really
the
depends.
chamber,
Yeah, from the chamber.
But
Do you wanna-
you'd know too that
Yeah, so-
they needed health.
all the commercial documents, depending on the country, like you saw. Some of them might require health certificates, but you'll need your commercial invoice, which proves the purchase price paid for your consignee, usually a packing list, and your certs of origin and the bills of lading that go with it.
So the way I kind of think of it in very layman's
The
terms
document
is
pack.
the chamber almost acts like, you know, when you've got a stat deck and you go into the pharmacy and they witness that what you've got on that stat deck, they've seen you sign. That's kind of what we're talking about in terms of the service. So if you need your invoice certified, so to speak, we do that. If you need your packing list certified, and Marion can talk through a range of other documents if you need it. So we're really here to service whatever you need in terms of documentation. If you need, or if your importer needs something else, or if you're curious to know about something, we'll put you in the right direction of the shipper or DFAT or ACCI or whoever it might be. But we can really act as your first port of call on just those really logistical things and hurdles to get over.
The requirements actually usually come from the importer itself.
Just wait for the mic, sorry, so we can hear you, that's all.
So if you're using a freight forwarder, they will fill out the certificate of origin themselves. Is that what you were saying before, or that's still the...
In most cases, sometimes they don't. So a number of our larger, for example, some of our lobster clients, they use a freight forwarder, but they prefer, because the weights might change overnight or over a weekend, they will sometimes come direct to us. So they work with both, and we're comfortable to do both as well. Is that right, Mary?
Yeah, and it depends on the size of your company. If you've got a very large company, you've obviously got a shipping department, you've got your own staff. You know, they're not all in production line. You know, you've got people that are overheads that would actually take it on. But there's also some very large freight forwarders that work for multiple companies, big and small, and they just find that the freight forwarders or agents, customs agents, they just have a superior knowledge sometimes, especially if you're a small company. You know, they actually know the rules, whereas you could stumble around quite a bit yourself to try and get it. I'm not pushing any particular people sitting next to me.
Yes, do a great job.
But we do it for our clients as well, yeah.
Yeah, so they know all the compliance rules and that, and so what I found in my relationship with the freight forwarders is, if you have a question, they don't go, well, that'll cost you $10 an hour or $100 an hour to answer it. They're very open with people starting up and to give them assistance. Of course, they want your work, but so the terms, how are you going to sell the product? Are you going to use a letter of credit? Are you going to sell TT, which is, you know, telegraphic transfer? Or if you're selling at FOB, like Nathan said, so that's free on board, but then you've got the risk factor. So this is where this Incoterms, this is the new version of it, and I think you would agree it's a lot easier for people to actually look at it than the old one. The old one was like from 10 years ago. And what it does is it takes each little section of it, and it gives you these tiny little diagrams, but they're very sensible, because what it does is it actually tells you where your risks stop and where your importer, where this risk stops. So FOB, the risk is all with the people who are buying the goods. CIF is cost, insurance and freight. So you're basically covered all the way. So your goods are insured all the way till it gets to the other end. And freight forwarders, they know all these. They know these rules. So us as the chamber, we don't get involved in any of that. So if we see your invoice, all we are doing is checking to make sure that the weights on the invoice comply with the weights that are on the certificate, that comply with the weights of the packing list. A freight forwarder would actually say to you, well, you've got CIF on one document here, and this is missing, or so where is your insurance? Like, so have you got commercial insurance? Have you insured your product? That's where freight forwarders come into their own for that.
I think that's a big fear. Like, I know what you're talking about. So freight forwarders are not like lawyers or accountants. It's not charged by the hour. It's, we provide the service of, you hire us to get the goods there. So we'll do pretty much everything other than sign off the chapters like you guys do and stuff like that, or COOs. But, as many questions as you can fire at us is the best way to do it. We're not going to say, well, that's another $50, that's this, that, we're here to help you, because the more information you get out at the start, and the more streamlined you make it, the better processes you get right from the beginning, the easier our job is, for one, and the easier it's going to be for you guys as well. So don't be fearful to even just ring us and just say, this is what I'm thinking of doing in a year's time, where do I start? And we'll just give you a whole bunch of information, won't cost you anything. That's just how it works, right?
And I think that's whilst the complexities of everything you've heard today can be incredibly overwhelming, and, even as someone that's not dealing with it on a daily basis, just listening to some of the quirky things Marion and the team do deal with, it is a complex area, but the reverse side of that is, I think there are so many industry bodies, DFAT, ACCI, ourselves, the shipping agents, there's such a recognition that it's really complex, and that we all win if we can get the product to market. And we're a long way away from everybody. Our ways to get products to market are so much more complex than a number of other nations, that as an industry, if you guys can collaborate, even sharing some of the shipping containers and looking at the buyer's space, all of those things just mean we're all working together for the same objective. And you see it in how successful the lobster industry has been in working together, despite the fact, highly competitive industry, and you hate each other. They really do. But they have an ability to get space on flights, to get shipping to work, to get, the health certificates, some of the lobbying that you guys have done around trying to make that process easier for everybody, not just your own industry. And so I think if you are exploring it, please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and start asking some questions and work together on it, because the opportunity, as you've seen for those numbers, is absolutely huge. The money is there to support you from a federal and a state government perspective now. We've just got to find some ways to, keep focused on those outcomes.
I might just add, so obviously with no tourism coming in at the moment, but we found, in pre-COVID, that our greatest ambassadors in market were the people that came here, and the people that you want to sell to are the ones that are well-heeled, can travel, they have money. They're sort of looking for those experiences to replicate back home. And so I just encourage any of you that have venues, or you talked about your new place that you're building, when the world goes back to normal and people are coming here again, really think about how you tailor your experience for them, because they're your ambassadors going back home. Then even look at how you build your supply chains around them. So I know one company, one of the barriers, you buy wine cellar door in South Australia, but you don't want to carry that all the way back to China. So they've set it up. They've got product in market sitting there with a distributor. You can do the cellar door experience, end up buying product and have it delivered to your door before you get home in China. So those things they're there, but just start to think about, it's daunting, I can't travel all the way to China and do this work and invest, but a lot of the stuff you've actually got. You've got the experience here, you've got the product. So start to flip their thinking around how you might engage them when they come back, because they will come back.
That's really great advice. Thanks, Nathan. Is there any other questions? Or yeah, go for it.
So if you shipped to
Oh, we'll need it for the recording.
oh shit!
It's for all those people out there listening.
Excuse my French. If you've shipped to a destination once, can you then ship? And I have a vague idea of this from doing it ourselves, but the kind of continuous movement permission, or you can continue to sell to the same market. Obviously, you need relevant paperwork for each shipment. But is there, once you've shipped to somewhere once, does it then become easier to ship again, as obviously subject to using the same distributor or something?
Yeah, obviously with experience, it does become easier. Like the documentation will become easier. You'll know that they've got all the import permits ready. Like obviously difficult markets, you'll know that you need to get paperwork done quicker, or they just take electronic stuff. Like Singapore, everything's electronic. It does get a lot easier.
Basically, the rule of thumb is you don't want customs to remember you, because if they remember you, you've got a problem.
You've done something right.
Get it right first time.
And then it
just rolls. Yeah.
And Nathan, do you have any comment, I guess, about, I guess a smaller entry versus going in big bang, getting samples into, we've seen certainly at the export desk downstairs with China becoming so difficult, we're seeing a few of our exporters, putting smaller samples and testing the ground in Japan or Vietnam or some of those other markets. Can you start small, or do you have to kind of go in big?
No, I definitely can start small. I think pretty much everyone has, bar the big companies that decide that they're going to move to the USA for whatever reason. So, I work a lot with the salmon industry. They make those big strategic decisions about investing in Taiwan or somewhere else. Let's face it, most people can't do that. So it's really about having those relationships to open those doors, and then when those doors open, just be ready to act on it. And yeah, it's a sample half the time. And you do have a lot of inquiries that take up time, but you have to be prepared to work through that to get the good ones. And unfortunately, that's just part of the journey. You get better at weeding them out too. But yeah, I think we're all going to have to start small. But we can collaborate too, and I know people don't necessarily think we're sharing the profit base, but we're actually working better together. So if you can find ways to do that, then you can have a sort of bigger bang if you're saying WA, beer in China, for example, versus just your one company. So look for ways to do that if you can, and your associations are a great place to start.
Fantastic. Anything else before we wind up for beer and...
I will say one more thing. I've never been to a presentation where the beer's being drunk at the start. So very impressed.
Contemplating it, but
the seafood game's going to have to sort itself out.
Yeah, absolutely. You missed our chamber function at the accounting firm, Nathan, where the wine and beer was just out all night. It was like a BYO party in the backyard somewhere. Nice. So. But no, we're very grateful to have you all here. As I said, the chamber is here. If you've got any questions, please ferry them through. Nathan and Brian, thank you for your expertise and your time. It is such a complex industry, as we've talked about, and having amazing stakeholders and people like yourselves that are so willing to share your knowledge is just fantastic. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you all, and thank you, Marion, again, for just always being there for everybody to answer any questions that come across your desk. Guys, help yourselves to beer. I'm sure you don't need a second go at that. Help yourselves to sausage roll, and you're welcome to stay here and hang about.